This is somewhat of a follow-up to a segment that went pretty viral on CBS morning show about a week and a half or so ago. So, folks, this is in reference to an interview that went pretty viral. For those of you who do not know, Ta-Nehisi Coates came onto the CBS morning show here to plug his new book, of which about a third is devoted to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and he frames it very simply in terms of his opposition to apartheid ethno-states. He basically lays out the case that Israel is an apartheid state, and Tony pushed back on him and said, it sounds like you're saying Israel shouldn't exist. Israel has no right to exist. If you were to only read this book, you wouldn't think there's anything redeemable about Israel. Made a real, just really kind of came at him pretty hard. So now CBS says that interview did not meet their standards. So CBS News leadership is addressing with staff an interview conducted on the network's flagship morning program by a top anchor that the executive said did not meet its editorial standards. In an editorial call Monday, audio of which was obtained and published by the Free Press, CBS News executives Wendy McMahon and Adrian Rourke said the interview conducted by anchor Tony Dokoupil and of author Ta-Nehisi Coates fell short of the network's standards for journalism. Quote, "We will still ask tough questions. We will still hold people accountable, but we will do so objectively, which means checking our biases and opinions at the door," they said on the call. During the interview, Dokoupil pressed Coates about a section of his new book in which he criticizes Israel over the ongoing war in Gaza, asking him why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it, and pressing him about Israel's, quote, right to exist. The online news site Puck reported several staffers at CBS were angered by how Dokoupil conducted himself during the interview, arguing he injected his own bias into the conversation. One reporter at CBS can be heard on the call pushing back on network leadership, saying Tony prevented a one-sided account from being broadcast on our network about a deeply complex situation that completely was devoid of history or fact. We'll get to all of this in due time, but first we're going to play.
That's Elon Pape, right? Who said the greatest trick Israel ever pulled was convincing people it was complicated.
That it's complicated, right? Exactly. So we're going to play some of this audio that was obtained by the Free Press. We're going to play a piece of the Free Press's commentary on that from Batya Angar Sargon, and then we're going to play the audio from, is she named here? One CBS reporter. No, Jan Crenshaw, I think her name is. What's the name of that last one? Yeah, Jan Crawford. She's the one who took Tony's side. So we'll play all that, starting with the big piece of audio that the Free Press came upon.
And there are times we fail our audiences and we fail each other. We're in one of those times right now. And it's been growing. And now we are at a tipping point. Many of you have reached out to express concerns over recent reporting, specifically about the CBS Morning's Coates interview from last week, as well as comments made coming out of some of our correspondents' reporting. I want to thank every single one who reached out for your honesty, your transparency, and your commitment. So I want to address three things. Number one, after a review of our coverage, including the interview, it's clear there are times we have not met our editorial standards. Number two, this has been addressed, and it will continue to be in the future. And number three, I want to acknowledge and I want to apologize that it's taken this long to have this conversation.
Okay, so now we're going to go to the Free Press's commentary on this issue from Batya Angar Sargon, because they took issue with the fact that CBS... they took issue with the fact that CBS is bothering to reprimand their host. Meanwhile, and look, he has not been fired. She didn't ream him there, but she mentioned, hey, some of our colleagues here within the network, within the organization, thought that he injected his own personal bias in an inappropriate way into this interview. So here is the Free Press panel on that, specifically Batya Angar Sargon.
when I first saw that clip with Ta-Nehisi Coates, I was so thrilled because I've been trying to make this argument that anti-Zionism is just wokeness Middle East edition forever. You take, the distinction that Western civilization is built on, that there's a distinction between right versus wrong, and you throw that away and replace it with the distinction between powerful versus powerless, and then you superimpose skin color onto that, and boom, whoever has less power is the victim and is always inherently virtuous, including during the Second Intifada when they're blowing up children. And whoever has allegedly more power is therefore inherently evil and therefore is always, always at fault and has all the agency. And the side with less power has no moral responsibilities, right? And then so
you see what they're doing here. You see, like, that lays the anti-woke grift to bear.
I haven't even seen this.
In broad daylight. They just want license to oppress people. They want license to subjugate people. They want license to dominate people. And their response when they're called out for it is, well, you're a cultural Marxist is the term that they like to use. Well, you're just describing dynamics of right and wrong. You're substituting that with powerful versus powerless, and you're assuming that people with power are always wrong and that the people with no power have no moral agency. What you're describing is, in this context, a clear-cut example of how people in power are abusing that power to evil ends over people with no power who, yes, do lack moral agency because they lack political autonomy. They lack political autonomy. You can't ascribe agency to an entity with no autonomy. If you afford an entity no autonomy, you deny it agency. That's obvious. And they just say that in this whiny tone of voice to sort of act as though what I just said is not reasonable. No, what I just said is perfectly reasonable. That's the way most people are starting to think about this now, which is why that interview caused such a problem, because you brought someone who has been afforded a lot of cultural cachet within these elite media circles in to talk about an issue like apartheid. He criticized apartheid, and then the idiot host took a contrarian view on apartheid.
Right.
And they don't see a problem with that because they're pro-apartheid, and they want to frame anti-apartheid sentiment as wokeness repackaged. Exactly.
Right. It is very interesting that this whole movement, such as it is, took such a long way around to have the avant-garde point of view of Victorian era British people.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You know, this is a lot of learning they did to become just Victorian Brits.
Yeah, right, exactly.
This is just a very classic argument for colonization. These people are savages.
Right.
When they fight back against us, they're showing how savage they are. Right. Not that they are taking exception to being oppressed. Right. And there's an underlying assumption of the West and its value system as being literally morally superior to those of the people resisting them. So even if you have been colonized, your resistance is wrongheaded because we're bringing you enlightenment.
Right.
We're bringing you civilization. The idea that the West is uniquely concerned with right and wrong, that is a Western value, the concern with right and wrong, when it's the underpinning of all philosophy developed by all cultures anywhere at all points in time, even below the level of the state, even at a tribal level. The idea that the West is uniquely concerned with questions of right and wrong. And when you look at the history, we certainly have not carried over that concern to the way we've treated other people. And hey, I have always said when this subject comes up, I don't believe the West is uniquely evil. I believe I believe that states are as evil as their opportunities very often, and the West had unique opportunities to do what many states before it have done: enslave, conquer, murder, ethnically cleanse areas. That's not unique to the West. Its opportunities historically were unique. And I do believe that seeing that history as invalidating all the accomplishments of the West, all the moral philosophy of the West. Well, you could say that about the Arab world. You could say that about the Asian world. So you're going to throw out all the work of all of these civilizations because of their worst sins and their worst crimes. So I think that is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I do believe the conversation should be focused on taking the best, not just from the West, from all cultures, from all civilizations. I think that's very important as well, to develop a respect for other cultures and other civilizations and their accomplishments and the philosophical precepts that they've developed, and move forward as a species, try to leave that darkness of human history that is common to all human history, not just Western history, behind. But for these people, they are just making the classic, the West is the best argument.
Right.
And if you're fighting against it, it's because you're ignorant. What's very interesting about their anti-woke thing is they're making, in the end, a woke argument that they want Israel to be a protected class.
Right.
They want that group to not be held to the moral standards that we would very quickly hold any country that's not a client state. In the end, they are the wokest of the woke.
Of course. Of course. All right, so then there's one piece of audio that the Free Press put in their article that was not part of the video. But this is Jan Crawford, who stood up for Tony and basically categorized Ta-Nehisi Coates' position as being devoid of history and fact. So we'll hear a voice from the opposition here.
So I guess it sounds like we're calling out one of our anchors in a somewhat public setting on this call for failing to meet editorial standards, or I'm not even sure what. Like, I don't understand how Tony's interview or any of his comments that he's made with anchors fail to, meet our editorial standards that obviously go back to the days of Murrow and Cronkite, which, of course, I thought our commitment was to truth. And when someone comes on our air with a one-sided account of a very complex situation, as Coates himself acknowledges that he has, it's my understanding that as journalists, we are obligated to challenge that worldview so that our viewers can have that access to the truth, or a fuller account, a more balanced account. And to me, that is what Tony did. He challenged Coates' worldview, his one-sided worldview. Coates got to respond. It was civil. I mean, I'd have to look this up. I don't know if I'm quoting it exactly, but I read the Washington Post, and they said it was calm and, heartfelt. I think those are the words they used. And
so it didn't devolve into a WWE smashing chairs over each other's heads. That made it okay.
Well, the problem with what she's saying, and she doesn't understand this because she's a brainwashed Zionist, is that the argument Coates was making was not complicated. It was actually very simple. And part of the reason why that interview went as viral as it did is because he put it in very simple terms to Tony's face. You're either pro-apartheid or you're not. Apartheid is either right or it's wrong. And so in her mind, Jan Crawford's mind, the CBS host, Tony DeCouple, was, bringing another side to a very complicated story. The problem is anybody who has their head on straight doesn't see this as a complicated story. Tony DeCouple was making a pro-apartheid argument on CBS. And as that issue comes so clearly into focus, as the simplicity of it, as the black and white nature of it becomes so obvious, people who take the contrarian view are going to be called out for it. And it is going to be categorized as bias, not as objective journalism. If you brought in a scholar of apartheid South Africa who had a book about the horrors of apartheid South Africa, and one of your hosts pushed back and said, well, wait a minute. Are we not? Is it unfair to put all the blame on white South Africans? Did black South Africans not have any agency? Were they not somehow responsible for the situation that they were in as victims of an apartheid state? You could never say that on the air. You would be run off the air for that. Of course you'd be criticized for that. Of course you would be accused of bringing bias to that. And part of why he got pushback is because Ta-Nehisi Coates put the issue as simply as that. And he is the exact wrong guy in their minds to come and make that argument, because they have awarded him such cultural capital that when he comes in and says this is apartheid, the only way to push back against that coming from his mouth is to expose yourself as a biased actor in favor of apartheid. And of course you're going to get pushback for that. But she doesn't understand that. They want to present this as a very complicated case, and as Ta-Nehisi Coates bringing a one-sided, simplistic, reductive, ahistorical attitude to this, when that is not what he did. He came out, he laid out a very simple case,
right?
And
well,
Tony
that's why it was
DeCoppel
so
blatantly
devastating.
took the wrong side,
Yeah.
We'll finish this up.
I don't see how we can say that failed to meet our editorial standards. I mean, I thought our editorial standards focused on, when we announced this in a public setting, which I understand you say you've addressed it with Tony. I don't know what that even means, but it's when we fail to, or when we broadcast false information, or we don't adequately verify something, which we have done in the past, and we've acknowledged that. But here, I think Tony did the opposite. He prevented a one-sided account from being broadcast on our network about a deeply complex, as you said, situation that, completely was devoid of history or fact. And as journalists, it seems to me that's what we have an obligation to do. And as someone that does a lot of interviews, including on controversial topics with public figures, I'm not really sure now.
So Tony did a great job in preventing an anti-apartheid argument from airing unchallenged. He pushed back on an anti-apartheid argument. He gave the pro-apartheid side, right?
Well, this is a masks off moment all around, because you hear this candid conversation. It shows you what absolute criminal idiots are being paid good salaries to bring you the news, so-called news, and what kinds of biases they're bringing into that process. And then on the other side, with the free press, it's an extension of what we saw, douchebag dialogues. All these anti-woke people, they're just very conventional 19th century Western chauvinists with a lot of references to transhumanism and 21st century elements sprinkled into their rhetoric. But in the end, they're just old school colonial Western chauvinists. That is their vision of the world, and they justify it with a lot of very elaborate scaffolding.
Yep. And you're right. It is all being laid to bear. And it's great. It's great to see. And it's good that the newsroom, that people there had that pushback, because, again, the only way you could consider what Tony did good objective journalism is if you operate under the false premise that this is a complicated issue and that Israel is not really an apartheid state.
Right.
Which
they've gotten away with for 76 years.
Which is something they've gotten away with for 76 years. And now that they're not getting away with it anymore, you're not allowed to take a pro-apartheid position on the air without getting pushback. Again, they're not even saying he should be fired. They're just saying, hey, this was really kind of out of bounds. Right. Like, you're coming on here, like you bring Ta-Nehisi Coates on the show, and then you start trying to pin him down with a pro-apartheid argument. That's really bringing your own bias to the conversation in a way that does defy standards of objective journalism. Again, if this really were a complicated, like if society still saw this as a complicated issue, you could make that argument. The reason that argument falls flat, the reason that interview got pushback, is because thankfully society is finally progressing, evolving to recognize apartheid where it exists and try and do something about it. Like, how do you think the Civil Rights Act was won? Like, you have to be willing to, as a society, challenge a certain way of thought. Challenge.
South Africa was shocking.
There's no
in
such
the
thing
80s.
as separate but equal, and separate but equal is not acceptable. Therefore, we are, as a society, going to move on from that, and we're going to have to drag some of the mouth breathers along. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. So that's what's starting to happen now. And I don't understand the mindset of these people who are just resisting that. As like, how do you think any social progress was ever won?
Right. of course.
You know what I mean?
Well, and then these people, yeah, I remember I was very young when they really started. Reagan was president, and he was pro South Africa. They don't want to talk about that right now.
Right.
And you had that Sun City record dropped, where all the hip hop stars of that era did something to raise awareness about South Africa. And I remember I was a teenager. I was shocked that in the modern world there was like a Western country that literally had apartheid. Even then, it was shocking that you still had a country functioning that way, and that it was complicated,
Right.
and that America
Right.
was supportive of the
Right.
government there. And eventually, yeah, they were America was shamed into changing its stance. With Israel, they've been able, unlike the South Africans had nothing to hide behind. The Israelis hide behind the Holocaust. They hide behind the historic oppression of Jews. And that is part of what's made it so difficult to pierce the veil of what Israeli society actually is. If it's not an apartheid state, what is an apartheid state? If that's not an apartheid state, what is an apartheid state? Where you can't use certain roads that Israelis can use. How is that not an apartheid state? By any definition, it's an apartheid state. The Holocaust deflector shield, it's finally losing its power, and the state is being revealed for what it's always been.
Please clap.